Good morning. My name is Adrian. I'm so glad that you've chosen to be with us today. If you're in the room or if you're at home worshiping with us, will you please stand as we sing together?
I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together, and every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. And I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you see them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountain is the God of the valley, and there's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. See this out, church? Well, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas
crushing, in the pressing, you are making new wine. In the soil I now surrender, you are breaking new ground. So I yield to you and to your careful hand. When I trust you, I don't need to understand. Make me your vessel. Make me an offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. In the crushing, in the pressing, you are making new wine. In the soil I now surrender, you are breaking new ground. You are breaking new ground. So make me your vessel. Make me an offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Where there is new wine, there is new power, there is new freedom, and the kingdom is here. I lay down my old flames to carry your new fire today. Where there is new wine, there is new power, there is new freedom, and the kingdom is here. I lay down my old flames to carry your new fire today. So make me a vessel. Make me an offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. One of my favorite lines from that song is, I came here with nothing but all you have given me. What a great reminder that all the things that we have are given to us by God. Let's remember that as we move into a time of giving. If you're here in the room, you can go ahead and have a seat. We have volunteers that are available. If you have your gift ready, they can pick that up for you. Or you can give online safely and securely at crosswaychurch.com/give, or you can text any dollar amount to 84321. We just thank you so much for your generosity. We know this time is kind of uncertain and things are just weird, for lack of better word. But because of your gifts, we are still able to serve our community and to serve our church and its ministries as we serve. Will you pray as we give together as a family? Father, we thank you so much for all the ways that you provide for us, even in uncertainty. Father, you are worthy of all of our praise and all of our honor and all of our love. Father, we ask your blessings over these gifts, that you would use them to further your kingdom and to bring your name glory. We love you and we praise you and we adore you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Well, good morning. Good to see everybody here today. I'm so glad that you're here, whether you're joining us in person or you're joining us online. I'm just so pumped that you're here today. And by the way, just a few minutes ago, I got word that there's somebody who's joining us in person today, that they have been watching us online from Texas. So whoever you are, wherever you are, I'm just glad that is that you guys? That's you. Okay. Well, I'm glad that you're here today. So we're kicking off a brand new series entitled Pieces. And what we're doing in this series is we're talking about the Old Testament book of Job. And ultimately, the Old Testament book of Job is the story of a guy named Job and what happened to him and his encounter with God and his interactions with God and what he learned in the process of what he went through. And before I talk to you, or before we talk about the story of Job, I want to talk about someone else's story for a moment. Let's call this person Lauren. Lauren was one of those people that was amazing at everything that she did. It didn't matter what she did, she was good at it, whether it was sports or academics or art. She was just one of those naturally gifted people that make people like me a little sick to the stomach because there's like one or two things that I'm actually good at in life. But she was just amazing at every single thing that she did. When she was in around 9th or 10th grade, she gave her life to Jesus Christ. And when she gave her life to Jesus Christ, she gave her whole life to Jesus Christ. I mean, she went all in for Jesus. And so she did everything that she possibly could to feed her faith and her relationship with God. Every time church was open, she would go to church. She became involved in her youth department, eventually became a leader there. She would read her Bible on a daily basis, and every day she would spend time in prayer, growing and growing in her faith. She's just an incredible young lady. And over the next few years, God ended up using her in some pretty phenomenal ways. God used her to bring her parents back into faith and back into the church. He used her to reach many of her friends for Jesus Christ. Many of her friends gave their lives to Jesus Christ too. And when she graduated high school, she had a whole bunch of options. She had some athletic scholarships at some major universities that would have led to some cool opportunities for her. She also had some other opportunities at other colleges that probably would have led to employment where she was going to be more than comfortable for the rest of her life. But as she wrestled through her options, she came to the conclusion that God didn't want her to pursue any one of those. Instead, she felt like God was leading her into full-time ministry. So she went to a Christian college. She turned down the scholarships and she turned down the other opportunities. And many people thought she was crazy, but she was so in love with God and so convinced that this is what he wanted for her life. So she went, and for a while, everything went really, really great while she was at that college. She met a young man who seemed like a really great guy. They had chemistry. She enjoyed being around him. He made her laugh. And the thing that she loved the most about him was that he seemed to love God too. He was at that college because he wanted to be a pastor. He wanted to be a preacher. And she was sure that God was going to use him in a great way. And she started picturing a future together where they would serve God and where that God would use them to help people begin a relationship with God and then grow in that relationship. And as the relationship progressed, things took a different turn. And all of a sudden, Lauren started to act different than she used to. Her friends and people that knew her well, they noticed, and they would try to ask her about it, but she would insist that everything was fine and that maybe she was just having a bad day. The longer that time went on, the worse and worse she became, and the stranger and stranger she would act. Eventually, her parents noticed, and on several different occasions, they asked her, they reached out to her to try to find out what was wrong and see if she would talk about it, but she just wouldn't. She just kept them at arm's length. Now, what her parents didn't know but strongly suspected was that Lauren was being abused by that young man. She was abused physically, she was abused emotionally, and she was abused in other ways too, on a daily basis. And perhaps the most insidious part of it all was that young man was using his faith as a weapon to keep her under his thumb. He convinced her that she was worthless, that she didn't have value, and that she was second rate. Eventually, she broke out of that relationship, but it marked her. It marked her for good. Over the next few years, she wrestled with the things that he had convinced her were true about her. Despite what her counselors told her, despite what her pastors told her, she still couldn't get past the idea that she was used goods and that she was worthless. As a pastor, I have had people come into my office and tell me stories like that. In fact, I've heard countless stories like Lauren's story. Stories of good people that had terrible things happen to them. And to be real honest with you, every time I encounter one of those stories, every time somebody new comes into my office to talk to me about that kind of stuff, I struggle a little bit inside. And I ask questions that I'm sure that you ask too. I wonder, well, why? Why did this happen to them? And I think to myself, it's not fair. Why would something like that happen to someone like that? I'm guessing I'm probably not alone. I'm guessing that there have been times in your life where you've encountered some sort of terrible thing that happened to somebody else, or maybe you had to deal with some sort of terrible thing and you wondered to yourself, why? Why is this happening? Why is God allowing this? This just doesn't seem fair. But the good news is that the story of Job helps us with those questions. It explores those subjects in an honest way, but also a helpful way. Job's story begins in a place called the land of Uz. In Job chapter 1, verse 1, we read, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job." So the author wants us to know, look, Job's story starts in Uz. Now, scholars, they're not really sure where Uz is located. They kind of have narrowed it to a general geographic region, but they're not sure about specifically where it is. What we are told later on in the text is that Uz was in the east. And we're meant to understand that Uz was a land that was east of Israel. Job himself was probably not an Israelite, even though he did worship the Israelite God. And he wasn't living in Israel. And I think the author wants us to know this because it's important that we understand that Job's story is not Israel's story. Job's story is the story of everyone. It's the story of you, and it's the story of me. It's the story of our life and what happens in our world to us. So from here, the author, who we're uncertain about who the author is of the book of Job, but the author wants us to understand what kind of a man exactly that Job was. So he gives us a resume, and what we end up getting is Job's resume that's a rather impressive one. He starts to tell us about Job, and he says, look, this man, of course he's talking about Job, was blameless and upright. When the author says blameless, what he wants us to understand is that Job was above reproach in both his conduct and his character. He was the type of guy that treated people with kindness and fairness and dignity, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from, no matter what they looked like. He just treated people with kindness. When he went about his business and did his business dealings, he dealt fairly with people. He paid his taxes. He was extremely honest. If Job said it, you could take it to the bank because you knew it was going to be true. He was a good man. He didn't look for loopholes or ways out. He took the hard road when most people took the easy one. Job was blameless, but he was also upright, which is the author's way of letting us know that he took God's standards seriously. When God said, do this or don't do this, Job took it seriously. He didn't think of that as a suggestion or an option he could or should consider. He took that seriously. And as a way of life, he was generally obedient to God. He wasn't perfect, but he was doing better than most people. We're also told that he feared God, which doesn't mean that he was shaking in his boots afraid of God. What the author is trying to help us understand is that Job was the type of man who had a deep and sincere respect and awe and reverence for God. He just had a respect. And that shaped him, and that shaped his life, and it shaped the way that the decisions he made and the things that he said. And because of his love for God and his respect for God, he shunned evil. He started to love the things that God loves and hate the things that God hates. And since God hates evil, Job found himself in a place where he just hated evil, no matter where he encountered it, no matter how he encountered it. Job just loved God wholeheartedly. Now from here, his resume continues, and we read that he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is the kind of stuff that happens when a couple doesn't have internet or TV. But there's a specific reason why the author is telling us this. In the ancient world, 7 and 3 were considered to be ideal numbers. They represented wholeness and completeness, and they really represented God's abundant favor in somebody's life. So the author wants us to know that Job is a man who's been favored by God. And I think it's important also for us to understand that when we pick up Job's story, he is no longer in the active parenting years. He's no longer in that phase of parenting where he's changing dirty diapers, or he's cheering on Mrs. Job while she changes a dirty diaper, or he's not waking up in the middle of the night because the kid's throwing up and it's everywhere and they don't know what to do. He's not in the phase of parenting where his teenagers are coming home wanting body piercings and tattoos, or bringing home a weird boy or a weird girl or whatever it is. He's well past that season. His kids are in their adult years. And it's quite likely that Job and Mrs. Job are in the grandparenting years. When they bring the grandkids over, and they let the kids do the things that they never let their own kids do, like jump on the couch and things like that. And then they feed them all kinds of stuff they know isn't good for them, but the kids want, and they're like, we're grandparents and grandkids are awesome. So they feed them cake and ice cream and candy and hop them up on sugar and send them back to mom and dad. And then when the grandkids are gone, they sit around with their friends and they talk about how great grandkids are. And man, if I'd have known grandkids were so great, I'd have skipped over the kids and just had grandkids. I mean, this is the phase of life that they're in. Job is living life at its zenith. I mean, he's living a really, really good life. The resume continues in the next verse, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500, and some versions of the Bible read female donkeys, she-donkeys, or something like that, which seems like a strange detail, doesn't it? But here's why that shows up in your Bible, in your version of the Bible. In the ancient world, this is so gross, donkey milk was considered to be a delicacy. And I feel like when I look at the ancient world, they had a very low standard for delicacy. But it was considered to be a delicacy in their world, and it's like they didn't even know that coffee exists somehow. The coffee is the nectar of the gods. They're going to serve it in heaven, I promise. I'm a pastor, I know these things. But he had a lot of donkeys, and he had a large number of servants. Now, in the ancient world, there were three things that determined a person's wealth: land, animals, and servants. And Job had all of them in spades. What the author wants us to understand is that Job was very, very comfortable financially. He had all of his wants and needs met, and he enjoyed the finer things of life. Now, on top of that, we're told he was the greatest man among all the peoples of the East. So Job was well respected. He was well respected in his own family, and he was well respected in his community, and even beyond that. When Job would sit down and talk about a subject, maybe it would be parenting, or how to be a good husband, or how to manage your money, or how to run a business, or how to spiritually walk closely with God, people would sit down and be quiet and they would listen. Because Job was the guy that everybody wanted to be like. When Job would write books, people would read them. When Job did a podcast, people would listen. Nobody criticized Job, because Job, there was really nothing to criticize about him. He was a good man. His resume continues. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their three sisters to eat and drink with them. And I think this fact, by the way, is a testament to the parenting of Job. His kids are in their adult years, and they don't just tolerate each other. They like each other. And they find an opportunity regularly to get together and spend time with each other when they no longer have to. I think that's a testament to Job's parenting. So his kids get together on a regular basis, oftentimes around birthdays, and then we read, when a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And don't miss this part, because this is very important. This was Job's regular custom. So what we're given here is a picture of a man who deeply and sincerely cares about the spiritual welfare and the spiritual development of his kids. He cares about every single one of them, where they are in their relationship with God. Are they growing? Are they going God's way? Are they not going God's way? And so every time that they would get together, he would offer a burnt sacrifice as a way of trying to make sure, just in case something didn't happen the way it should, or maybe they did something to offend God, he would offer a burnt sacrifice just to make sure. As a way of dedicating each child to God and acknowledging God's ownership of them and their lives. For Job, being the spiritual leader in his home was his job. And ensuring, even in his adult years when he didn't even have to, that his kids were growing in their faith, he felt like that was his job. And he didn't farm it out. He didn't farm it out to a church. He didn't farm it out to a pastor or a spiritual leader or anybody like that. He took his role seriously. He doesn't just walk closely with God. He's very diligent about making sure his family does too. And Job's just a good man. When we read about Job, when we read about the beginning of his story and what happened to him, Job's going about his life. He's being a good husband. He's being a good father. He's being a good grandfather. He's being a good businessman. He's being a good member of the community. He's worshiping and loving his God. And everything's going really, really well for Job. Now, what Job doesn't know is that there are some other events that are happening in another arena. And when we go from verse 5 in Job to chapter 1 to verse 6, you and I are transported to another scene, another series of events that's happening in the heavenly realm. In verse 6, we read, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. So we're given a picture that there's this meeting in heaven. or in the heavenly realm somewhere where the angels gather to report. Apparently, they've all been given assignments, and they've come back to report to God to kind of say, hey, look, here's how it went, here's what we did, all that sort of stuff. And the impression we're actually given in this passage and in other passages of Scripture is that this is a regular occurrence. This is something that happens on the regular basis. So the angels gather to report and tell about everything and to receive their new assignment when an unwanted intruder shows up. And we read, and Satan also came with them. Apparently, Satan has been informed about the meeting, and he decides to show up too. Now, I want to pause here for a moment, and I want us to think a little bit or consider who exactly has shown up. I want to talk about Satan for a minute because there's a whole lot of ideas out there about who Satan is. Some people think Satan is some sort of a theological concept or construct or an idea. Some people think, and they don't normally think that he's real. Other people think he's real, but they sort of picture him as a red being with horns and a pitchfork and a pointy tail. And the way they picture it, or at least a lot of people do, is that the real devil, that red guy, sits on one shoulder while maybe an angel sits on another, and he sort of whispers things into your ear that you shouldn't do, encourages you to do wrong things. And both of those thoughts and ideas are actually wrong. It's important that you understand that Satan is the most beautiful, the most powerful, and probably the most cunning and brilliant archangel that God ever created. And he was like that when God created it, and he's like that now. He's every bit as beautiful, every bit as powerful, and every bit as brilliant and cunning. And what you need to understand is that he is consumed with destruction. He is bent on it. It is the supreme commitment in his life, doing destruction in the lives of God's people and destroying God's purposes in this world. In fact, this word Satan here can also be translated or meant to be understood this way. He's the adversary or the accuser. And that is the one that shows up for the meeting in the heavenlies. Now, needless to say, Satan stood out like a sore thumb. He was the elephant in the room that everybody knew was there, but probably nobody was talking about. So in the next verse, God decides to talk and address the elephant in the room. And here's what he said to Satan, look, where have you come from? Now, God doesn't ask this question of Satan because God doesn't know. God's all-knowing. He knows where Satan has been. It's kind of like God telling Satan, look, tell me what you've been up to. He's trying to solicit a confession from Satan. So Satan responds and he says, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. And at first glance, it almost seems like Satan's being kind of dodgy here, doesn't it? Seems like he's just kind of giving him some sort of lame, generic answer. But Peter, in the book of Peter, he tells us that Satan, or the devil, roams around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So when Satan says, look, I've been roaming throughout the earth, he means it. Literally. He's been roaming and looking and scheming for opportunity to do what he does best: steal, kill, and destroy. Remember, he's bent on that. And God knows that he's just been given an honest answer, but it's a little bit of an incomplete one. So God responds to Satan and he says, have you considered my servant Job? Which is an interesting question. And it's important, again, that we understand that God doesn't ask this question because he doesn't know the answer to it. This is one of those questions that's actually more like a statement. And to really understand what God's saying here, we got to take a hard look at this word considered. This word considered in the Hebrew language, the word that's translated here as considered, can also be translated as noticed or to set your heart on. So what God's saying to Satan is he's saying, look, have you set your heart on Job? He's functionally telling Satan, look, I know you've been doing that. I know you've been looking for opportunities to steal, to kill, destroy, and I know that you've been watching Job, and I know that you've been looking for an opportunity, and I know that you're searching for a chink in his armor because you want to bring him down. I know that you've been scoping out Job. God goes on to say, look, here's what you may have missed, or in case you haven't, there's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. In other words, maybe you missed this, or maybe you haven't, but he loves me. He's committed to me. He's faithful to me. So Satan decides to respond. And I imagine that as Satan responds to God, there's this collective gasp in the heavenlies. Because what Satan goes on to say is so wildly offensive. Nobody in their right mind would ever dream of saying this to God. So they gasp, and I imagine there's a little bit of a sinister tone on Satan's voice when he says it, and perhaps there's a little bit of a precursor statement where Satan goes, well, since you brought it up, since you want to talk about it, since you remember, you're the one who brought up Job. Satan responds and he says, does Job fear God for nothing? He continues and he says, have you not put a hedge, which is a protective fence, around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. And then he finishes by saying, but now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he'll surely curse you to your face. Satan says, God, don't be so naive. Job doesn't love you. He only loves what you do for him. Take a look at his life. Who wouldn't love you? Look at everything you've done for him. He's healthy. His kids are healthy and fine. His grandkids. He's financially secure. He's well respected. You've done nothing but good. He hasn't really dealt with anything difficult in life up to this point. He doesn't really love you. You're not really worthy of worship. Job knows. He's just trying to look, Job is only in it for what he can get out of it. God, let me take away some of those comforts. Let me take away some of those blessings. Let me take away some of that stuff, and you'll see what his faith is made of. You'll see. He doesn't really love you. He just is in it for what he can get out of it. Now, I think that the reason why Satan says this is because he's seen it before. A lot. Satan has spent enough time around religious people that he knows that oftentimes we're only in it for what we can get out of it. We don't love God necessarily. We love the benefits. And it's right here in this moment where Satan raises the central question. The central question in Job's life, the central question in your life and in my life, and then probably the central question in the entire book of Job. And here's what it is. Do you love the gifts or the gift giver? And I think you should take a moment to personally wrestle with that question. Do you love God because of what you get out of it? Or do you actually just love him? Are the gifts what you're after, or is God himself the prize? Is he really truly worthy of worship just because of who he is? Or are you just doing that as a means to an end? Do you love the gifts or the gift giver? Satan insists that Job's just in it for what he can get out of it. And I think if Satan were talking about you and me, he might say the same thing potentially. And I wonder if it would be true. So God says, look, let me test, or Satan says, look, let me test his faith. In the next verse we read, God said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself, do not lay a finger. Satan says, okay, or God says, okay, you can test his faith, but here are the parameters. Here are the boundaries. You can't go here. And Satan leaves the presence of God with a huge, sinister grin on his face. And he wastes no time destroying Job's life. And as we're going to discover in a singular day, he dismantles and destroys Job's life. You know, there are some things in life, some events that are so traumatic and so painful that they have a way of etching themselves into our brain. Like they were so hard and so difficult and so big that we remember all the details surrounding that moment. For me, one of those moments is 9/11. I remember where I was. I remember who told me. I remember what they said. And I remember almost every single moment of that day in excruciating detail. What's about to happen to Job is his 9/11. And I think probably what made it harder for Job was the fact that it came without warning. And it came without explanation. He had no idea that this conversation had ever happened. So Satan goes to work, and in the next verse we read, one day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house. And I think this verse is here to let us know that on the day that this happened, everything was going like it probably normally did for Job. It was probably a good day. Job got up, he worshiped God, spent time in prayer, studied the scriptures. He ate breakfast with his wife. Perhaps it was his favorite meal. They enjoyed some pleasant conversation, maybe laughed and even flirted with each other a little bit. And then Job went to the office and he sat down with some of his leadership team and they talked about some of the things that were coming up and some of the opportunities, and they looked at the metrics and everything seemed to be going up and to the right. Came back home, was enjoying lunch with his beautiful bride, talking about their grandkids and giggling over the last funny thing that their grandkid did, taking a look at pictures and stuff. He looks out his window, and I'm sure he can see the fields out there, and they're growing, and he thinks about harvest time and how harvest is coming soon and how that's such a happy time of the year. And everything's going really well. And all of a sudden, Job gets a knock at the door. And this particular knock at the door will change everything. Nothing will ever be the same again. And maybe you know what it's like to be Job in this moment. Maybe for you, it wasn't a knock at the door that changed everything. Maybe it was a phone call in the middle of the night. Or maybe it was a meeting with the doctor where he told you what the diagnosis was. Or maybe it was a letter in the mail. Or perhaps it was a meeting with a boss who told you that the company is downsizing and that your services would no longer be needed. But if I were a betting man, I'd bet that many of us have been where Job is in this moment. There's a knock at the door, and in the next verse we read, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby. And the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. And I'm sure Job's sitting there and he's got so many, wait, what? The Sabeans, what? They did, when did this happen? How did this happen? Like, what? And as he's trying to sort through it in his mind, we read in the next verse, while he was still speaking, he, as in the guy who was telling him about the tragedy, the initial tragedy, while that guy he was speaking, he gets interrupted by another guy who comes in and he says, look, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. And Job's going, wait, what? 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 Like, how is this possible? Like, wait, and he's trying his best to comprehend it. Now, I want to kind of stop here and make a little bit of an observation. It's interesting to me, this phrase, the fire of God fell from the heavens. Now, probably what's being described here, just so you know, is a lightning storm. But it's interesting to me how they describe that lightning storm. They basically say it's from God. Which is a strange way, right? Like, why don't they say the fire of Satan? Because God's not doing any destroying here. It's Satan. Satan's the one doing the wrecking of Job and the wrecking of Job's life. But in spite of that, God is the one that gets blamed. And interestingly enough, when stuff goes wrong in our lives today, or in the lives of people we know, or the lives of people we love, God's still getting blamed, isn't he? We still blame God. God, if you would have known, or if you'd have cared, or if you'd have answered my prayer, or if you'd have been there, if you hadn't have been so silent. We just blame God. We even blame God for things that we do, that are consequences, that when we find ourselves in terrible situations, which really are the consequences of the decisions that we made. We blame God. But listen, you cheat on your spouse, people like that end up getting divorced oftentimes. That's not God's doing, that's yours. If you're lazy, and you don't work hard, and you're difficult to get along with, and you cut corners, those types of people tend to get fired. That's not God's work, that's yours. If you don't take care of your body, if you don't eat right, you don't sleep right, you don't exercise, and you chain smoke, you're likely to have health issues. That's not God, that's you. If you spend every dollar that you make, you don't save for the future, you don't budget, if you just spend recklessly, if you live beyond your means, you tend to end up in debt, and people who end up in debt deep enough end up getting bankrupt. That's not God. That's you. We just tend to blame God when bad things happen. But I think it's worth noting that it wasn't God doing the destroying here. But he still gets blamed. So Job is trying to wrap his mind around this. He's trying to figure it out. Like, it's just not even computing. It's so overwhelming. If you've ever had a fact or a piece of data or something that was shared with you that was so big, it was almost impossible to comprehend, you understand where Job's at right now. In spite of how Job is whirling and trying to figure it out, in the next verse we read, while he was still speaking. In other words, that guy's given the bad news. Another guy comes in, interrupts him, and he tells him, look, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. And Job is just shell-shocked, just numb. He's literally lost everything just in a moment. It's unbelievable. He went from having a nice retirement and a business that was growing and thriving and security to being absolutely penniless just in a moment. You and I sometimes get a little worried about whether our stock value is going to drop or there's going to be a drop in the stock market. He lost everything. Everything. Out of nowhere. And if that wasn't bad enough, he's about to get the worst news of the day. We read, while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house. So normal day, good things happening, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert, which is probably a tornado, that's probably what's being described, and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. for the first time in potentially 25, 30, 35, maybe 40 years, Job and Mrs. Job are childless. And I kind of picture Satan and the demonic host watching the whole thing, smiling, laughing, snickering, talking amongst themselves, saying, hey, this is going to be the moment. We took it all. God's going to see. He doesn't really love him. God's going to understand that God really isn't worthy of worship. That Job is, like many people, just in it for what he can get out of it. God's going to see. Job's going to turn his back on God. He's going to walk away from him. And I'm sure that when Job does what Job does next, that their jaws just dropped. Here's what Job does. At this, Job got up, or he peeled himself up off of the ground. And he tore his robe and shaved his head, which in the ancient days was a sign of extreme mourning. Job was heartbroken. You could have heard Job's weeping and Job's mourning a mile away. If you've ever been there in a moment when a parent lost their kid, if you've ever heard those sounds come out of another person's mouth before, or maybe they've come out of yours, you know exactly what's happening right now. Job is standing in a puddle of his own tears, drenched from head to toe. He's brokenhearted. This is the lowest point of his entire life. And it's so much lower than he ever thought it would be or could be. He had no idea that this depth of grief was even possible. And what Job decides to do next may be the most shocking, and it may be the most counterintuitive part of the entire story. We read then, and we don't really know how long it was when then happened. Did he do it in the moment while he's getting the news? Or did Job wait until perhaps after the funeral, where he's standing at the gravesides of his 10 children, holding his wife, trying his best to comfort her and tell her that they were going to get through it? Meanwhile, in his head, not quite sure that that's actually true. And he's trying to comfort her, but he can't keep himself together, sobbing uncontrollably. Then he fell to the ground in worship. Like in the middle of his deepest pain, in the middle of a pain that he didn't even know was possible, in the middle of his enormous tragedy that came out of nowhere with no explanation, that just felt unfair, Job decides to worship. He falls down on his face, prostrates himself before God in a moment of complete and utter adoration of God. And it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? It feels kind of weird, right? But the reason why Job does this is because he knows something that we sometimes miss. Worship is warfare. Worship is how we fight against pain. Worship is how we fight against the ideas and the attitudes and the mentalities that threaten to overwhelm us. Worship is how we go to war in the middle of our pain. It's how we're supposed to fight our battles as people of faith. This is what we need to do. Job understood that the only way to get through this was to worship his way through it. That's the only way to survive. That's the only way to really thrive. That's the only real way to move forward, is to worship his way through it. And what's true of Job is true of you. I don't know what pain you find yourself in the middle of, but let me promise you, the best way to move through it is to worship your way through it. I feel like sometimes people don't understand what they're invited to when they're invited to church. When you're invited to church, whether it's in person or it's online, and somebody stands up at the beginning of the service and they say, hey, look, would you worship with us or would you sing this with me? What they're inviting you to do is to go to war. Go to war against the pain. Go to war against the difficulty. Go to war against the lies that Satan tells us that we so quickly and easily believe. Worship is warfare, and it saddens my heart as a pastor to look out at a bunch of people sometimes that are just standing there watching. When you're invited to worship, go to war. Go to war against the stuff that threatens to overwhelm you. Don't stand by and watch other people do it. You have no idea what you're missing out on. You're only hurting you. Worship is warfare. It's how we fight our battles in the middle of our pain. And listen, I know that for some of you, when I say that, you're a natural-born worshiper. And that feels right. You're like, yes, even though it may sound a little crazy. Yes, there's something inside your soul that's just, yes. And some of you, you're not. There's a part of you goes, no, I don't know about that. And maybe most of you, that just sounds weird in general to do that in the middle of that type of grief. But I want you to hear what he says in the middle of his worship. He's prostrate before God, going to war against the pain and the grief and all this sort of stuff, and all the things that threaten to take his faith and move his faith in a wrong direction. And here's what he says. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. So Job makes this profound observation that I hope you don't miss, because here's what he says. He goes, God, I've noticed I came into this world with nothing, and I'm going to leave this world with nothing, and everything in between is just on loan from you. God, it all belongs to you. Even in those moments when I think that it belongs to me, God, when I get a clear head about this thing, I know that it belongs to you. God, my job belongs to you. My finances belong to you. My car belongs to you. My house belongs to you. My body belongs to you. My children belongs to you. God, everything belongs to you. It's a gift that you have given me that is on loan. And because it belongs to you, you can take it back anytime you want. But I want you to know, I am so grateful that you gave it to me for the time that you did. And friends, can I tell you something? This may be a very hard truth for you. But you came into this world with nothing, and you're going to leave it with nothing too. Everything in between, it belongs to God, and it's merely being loaned to you. It's his. You see, it was this truth that Job had wrapped his mind around that enabled him to go to war in worship. And it was the worship that carried him through. Some of you find a hard time with the idea of worshiping God in the middle of your pain because you have not come to this conclusion yet. So maybe for some of you, it's important that you just concede that this is true. So Job worships. Chapter 1 finishes this way. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Translation, Job didn't turn his back on God. He stayed true. As it turns out, Job wasn't in it for what he could get out of it. For him, God was the prize. So he worshiped his way through it. I want to finish out today. We normally finish our service with a song. But again, we rarely have the framework for it that I've talked about today. We rarely understand it as warfare and how we fight our battles and we move through our pain with God. But with that in mind, I want to finish our service today with a song. And I want to invite you. I don't know where you are at. I don't know what you're going through. I'm sure if you're like everybody else, COVID-19 in this space has not been easy or good for you, and it's just hard. And maybe that's just been one of many things that have happened to you. Perhaps this has been a season for you of loss. But I want to pray, and then in a moment we're going to sing, and I want to invite you to go to war. Don't stand by and watch other people go to war. You go to war. This is how we fight our battles as believers. We worship through our pain. We worship through our pain. And as we do, we discover that God carries us through the whole way. So I'm going to pray, and let's sing, and let's go to war together. Father, thank you so much for the story of Job. Lord, one of the things that I love about the story is that you don't take off the rough edges, that it's just real and it's raw. And God, I think that's for me what makes it something that I can just so easily connect to. And God, there is that central question for every one of us. Do we love you or do we love your gifts? And God, I know most people well enough to know that we want to be able to say we love you more than we love your gifts. But sometimes it's a tricky dance. God, I pray that in the next few moments, Lord, that we would just declare together that you are worthy of worship, even in the middle of our pain, and even in the middle of our difficulty, in the middle of our struggle, in the moments that don't seem fair. And God, I pray that as we do that, Lord, that you would comfort, that you would guide, and that you would do what you do, that you would carry us through. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Grand earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice. The seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken from my regard. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well. You'll be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And it is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. Through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me.
How wonderful to know that we serve a faithful God that is worthy of our worship no matter what we're walking through. We thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad that you made the decision to participate, whether you're here in the room or you're worshiping with us online. If you have prayer requests throughout the week, or if you have questions about your relationship with God, or if you have any questions about what we're doing here at Crossway, please visit crossway.news. There'll be information about what's going on here and a way to reach out to us. Next week, when we meet again, we will be continuing our series through Job. I'm so excited to see what other truths and wisdom we can learn from this incredible story. We love you guys, and we'll see you soon.